We're ready to roll. Okay. Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the September meeting of the Overview and Scrutiny Committee at North Norfolk District Council. So item 1 on our agenda is to receive apologies for absence. I have apologies from Nigel Housden, Adam Varley and Emma Spagnola.
Correct, yeah.
And I think we've got one substitute or one qualified substitute to attend today, Councillor Tim Adams.
Correct, yes.
Don't know which of those 3 that you'd like to substitute for, but one thing's for sure, you can't cover all 3. Thank you.
Yeah. Chairman, if I can apologise for the fact that I have to leave the meeting at 11 o'clock.
Yes, okay, thank you very much for that. So, public questions and statements, I'm not aware of any.
None received.
Thank you. So item 4, which is the minutes of our last meeting. That's the meeting that was held on the 14th of July. And if we go through them for accuracy, page by page, please. So page 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. I take it from the silence and no hands raised that you accept those as a fair and accurate account of that meeting, and that you'll be happy for me to sign them as such. Thank you. I will then do so. Item 5, items of urgent business. I'm not aware of it.
No, I've not been made aware of any.
Thank you. Item 6, declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest from members today in relation to the business that we will consider? We've got the guideline sheet in our agenda pack. Anybody? No, there are no interests to declare in that case. Item 7, petitions from members of the public. I'm not aware of any.
Again, none to report.
Thank you. Item 8, consideration of any matter referred to the committee by a member. I'm not aware of it.
Again, none to report.
Thank you. Responses of the council or the cabinet to committee reports or recommendations.
I'm not aware of any major recommendations other than acceptance of reports that were recommended for approval. Having said that, I was on annual leave when cabinet took place, so you may know more than I, but I don't believe there is any.
I don't think that there are any that need to be brought to the attention of this committee today. Thank you for that. Right, turning then to matters of our substantive matters on the agenda. I'm aware that Councillor Buttercoat needs to leave us in half an hour or so's time, and I therefore propose to take the performance report as the first item on the agenda with your agreement. Very well, there seem to be no objections to that, so let's turn then to the performance report on our agenda, which is item 14, and it's pages 127 to 190. Councillor Buttercoat.
Thank you. I think everyone has seen the report and had a chance to review it. I think there's been an awful lot of progress on our corporate plan, despite what has been going on in this council in other ways in dealing with the COVID response. I think officers have really managed to start picking up the pace now, and I'm very grateful to them for their efforts. But I'm sure there will be questions, so I'm very happy to take any questions on the report.
Okay, thank you for that. Then. Questions to the leader? Councillor Cushing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I expect I'll probably sound a bit like a broken record, because I can only repeat some of the comments that I made in the Cabinet. But there I raised the point that I do challenge the validity of some of this reporting. And when I see a page full of green RAG ratings, first of all, in my long experience in corporate world, a RAG rating is based on time, cost and quality. Well, the time element doesn't seem to be very prevalent in all of this. When I see it's all green, and when you look at the number of actions in there, that does normally you would expect greens, ambers and the occasional red. As I made the point in the Cabinet meeting, we have 16 of those actions which have been moved, deferred into the future, a couple of those by as much as a year. The commentary makes no reference to that fact. Now, there may be valid reasons, there may not be valid reasons for that, but if you've got an MI report, which is actually meant to be for our benefit in order to shed light on the progress and performance, I thought something significant like that ought to be mentioned. In addition to that, there are another 8 actions where you actually had due dates in the past, but they are reporting RAG, green or amber. Well, I don't fathom that at all. If the due dates in the past, then surely I can't understand why that RAG rating wouldn't be red. We look at section 2, for example, and I compared this actually with the previous performance report. It's where I got my information from. The commentary hasn't even been updated in section 2, which is boosting business and sustainability and growth. So again, the commentary is even not up to date there. So if you're actually producing a report and updating the commentary, again, I challenge really the validity of doing that. It comes to the point, what's the point having a report if we're just going to try and gloss and make sure everything looks rosy in terms of what you're doing? I don't believe that's necessarily helpful to the council, to us. Reporting should be explicit in terms of what's actually happening, and I think this seems to be designed to me to be very rose tinted. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thank you for that. Councillor Buttigieg.
Thank you. Obviously, I've heard what you've had to say on this before. I don't believe it is rose tinted. I do believe it is a point in time, which is about 3 months ago now, and I think things have moved on significantly since then. I think I have been talking with the chief executive and with the chair, I've forgotten Linda's new, Linda, corporate business manager, and Steve, about the way we report, because I hear your concerns. And like I said to you at Cabinet, I have points that I think could be changed about this, because when I was sitting where you are, I used to make very similar comments. So we're looking at the reporting, but this is the way it has always been done. That doesn't mean it's right that it should always be done this way. And we will look at it and see where we go from here. But that's where we are at the moment.
So I hope I address this point at Cabinet. I think the concerns that Councillor Cushing raised are not inappropriate. I do think that the report, the dates have been changed on the basis of the priorities that were attached and agreed by Cabinet at their meeting of the 5th of October last year, where I worked with the Cabinet during August and September last year and said we couldn't make progress. It wasn't realistic to make progress across all of the objectives that had been detailed in the delivery plan because of the unprecedented situation that COVID changed. So there was a degree, I believe, a degree of honesty and intent at that time to say we can't do it all. So these are the Cabinet's priorities, and that decision was taken in public and in an open and transparent way. And I think the majority of the amended dates, which Councillor Cushing refers to, have been amended as against the original on the basis of that change. I think it would be more transparent to acknowledge that in the way that Councillor Cushing has requested, and that's the conversation that I've had with the leader of the council, Linda McGallagher, and Helen Thomas. Helen is on the call, Linda is on leave this week, in terms of making those amendments and changes to the document as we move forward. and the performance framework as we move forward. And there will be a further update in terms of the wider progress that's been made, because it wasn't just progress hasn't just been made on those 18 objectives that the Cabinet agreed last October. The housing strategy wasn't identified as a specific objective, but work has been progressed on that outside of those 18, because we haven't just looked at those 18. As the COVID situation has changed, people have come back to their mainstream jobs. So last summer, the people that were involved in the housing strategy development were still delivering the community support to vulnerable and shielding individuals, those regular contact calls, the responses around prescriptions and everything. That work has fallen away as people have been more confident as a result of the lockdown lifting after the first national lockdown, and they've had more robust and resilient support mechanisms in place, sometimes through community organisations which have continued, and the District Council has stood back and refocused its COVID interventions around the visitor economy and around supporting the vaccine programme, where our customer services team have continued to support the CCG and local GP practices reach out to people to encourage vaccine take-up. So the situation is very fluid. It is an exceptional period of time, but I'm happy to adjust or discuss with colleagues how we adjust the reporting to reflect those changes of dates that Councillor Cushing's referred to. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. Councillor Cushing, do you wish to respond to those?
Just briefly, and thank you, and I appreciate the comments from the group, the leader of the council and the chief executive. They're made with the benefit, to say the benefit of all of us. One of the other things I mentioned, if you're looking at baseline dates or due dates, well, you could have a baseline date and then the move date, so then all of us then can explicitly see where it's actually moved from, and then that gives rise to the commentary. And it's really the richness of the commentary that the chief executive has given that probably benefits all of us. So anyway, we'll wait to see the next performance report and to see perhaps the improvements have been made there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, it seems to me that there is recognition of the points that you make, and there's a measure of agreement, I think, to take that work on and incorporate suitable revisions, and hopefully you can be a part of that process. I think that would be very helpful if we were to be as inclusive in that process.
Yeah, there was, yes, that's fine. I mean, there was some, obviously at the previous cabinet meeting, I did explain the position between a number of the measures, say develop and implement. So if we have a strategy, in a number of cases, the communications strategy, the housing strategy, and almost the customer service strategy have been developed and reached a position of being adopted or signed off. There is then, in terms of the original performance measure, there is then the implementation, and you won't actually ever get to the end of that implementation because it will be a continuous position. So I think the development of the strategy, of a strategy where it's now showing as green, is the strategy's been developed and is completed and adopted, but the implementation will never end, such that is that appropriate for a red, an amber or a green? And I think we can possibly debate that and people might have different positions. But I think in terms of us developing and refining our approach to performance management and monitoring, we need to be cognizant of those definitions and use of language in terms of what we are actually doing, because some things will be finite, they will have a deadline, they will be completed, but then living those things and building upon those things will be an ongoing process, such that that journey is never complete, if you like, such until there's a point of time that the document or strategy is revisited being fit for purpose. And as a continuing improvement, learning, that's right that we do that, and we are taking steps with Helen and Linda to make sure that those documents are reviewed every 3, 4 or 5 years, dependent upon the nature of the document and their relative impact.
Okay, thank you for that. I've got Councillor Holliday and then Councillor Toy.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to raise again the issue of including benchmarking, because I think that would be very valuable. And I know that we can go to LG Inform and we can trawl through it for hours and pull out bits and pieces, but it'd be very helpful if we could actually have a comparison of how we're doing against reasonably similar areas. For example, if you take our household waste recycled, and I know the data is old because that's what's available, we were 41% in 1920, Broadland was 50, for example, and the percentage of minor developments processed in 8 weeks in 2021, we were 71%, Broadland was 90%. So there might be some valuable learning there that I think should be actually pulled out for us rather than actually us having to go and search for it. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. That's a good point. And I think since the demise of the comprehensive performance reporting era, the comparisons that were available to measure performance, relative performance across authorities has significantly declined. But I believe there is still facilities there, and I believe our Chief Executive may be able to help us in directing us towards those, and maybe that's something that we would wish to develop in due course.
That's fine. So yes, there is the LG Inform managed through the Local Government Association, which has sort of replaced comprehensive performance assessment as a benchmark, and indeed with the demise of the Audit Commission that looked at or took inspections of CPA. So the move around sort of improvement within the sector is now largely led through the LGA rather than out with the sector. An issue, I think, with our ability to benchmark against like authorities is that many of the authorities that were in North Norfolk's previous family group are no longer authorities, in that they have been unitarised. So we were in a group with some authorities, district councils in Cornwall, West Devon and West Dorset and Purbeck. They've moved to a unitary model, and it's East Lindsey in Lincolnshire, which is still 2 tiers. So the number of authorities which were in our family group, who as rural coastal authorities with strong tourism economies, with issues of development pressure as desirable places to live, high numbers of second homes, the people we can directly compare ourselves with has been reduced. So and yeah, we can compare ourselves with performance in Norfolk, and there is valuable work or understanding that can be gained in that regard. But we also need to understand that, you know, no one else has 6 blue flag beaches. Nobody else, no one else provides 39 public toilets. Broadland doesn't have a retained leisure service. So you're not making direct comparison around the entirety of the organisation. But that isn't to say our planning performance is, we know it's not where we want it to be relative to Broadland in terms of minor applications. And there will be other areas where authorities do better than us. That's an absolute fact. But there will be other circumstances where we perform better, and it's about understanding that in the round and the entirety of the council's offer, and the relative priority that any administration here wants to place upon one issue over and above another.
Thank you. I think we recognise that there will never be an opportunity or a situation where we'll be able to compare identical apple with identical apple. It will always be variations along the lines you comment. Councillor Batakova, was it on this matter you wished to?
Yes, it was. It was just to say, you know, the Chief Executive is absolutely right. It's very, very difficult for us to find another authority, but there are elements, I would say, that within the report that we should be able to find the ability to balance and show you a comparison with. So you'll have to bear with us if it might appear that we're jumping around, but that would be why, so that you can have the best comparisons.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Toy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for allowing me to speak. Yeah, I just, some great stuff here. I've made some notes, and I'm pleased to see that we can work together to try and produce good reporting. I just wanted to The debate's been about how we report and what we report, but actually what's underneath that Councillor Butikofer mentioned at the beginning is actually performance has improved. And this is about monitoring performance. And I think we can see things have been delivered. Chief Executives mentioned the things that have gone on, you know, where we've got blue flag beaches and all the other things that is listed. So yeah, I just wanted to, you know, acknowledge that officers, despite the fact that we're questioning the reporting, and rightly so, but actually there is been an improvement in performance and has been delivery on many plans. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else wish to speak? No? Oh, sorry, Councillor Withington.
Hello. Good morning, everybody. I would like to say as well, I appreciate Councillor Cushing's points, but I think there are also lots of instances in the report where it is well explained why interventions have been made or deferrals have been made. So I think it's important that we see the report as a whole and identify that general movement of moving forward based on that review during COVID, where we narrowed down some of the objectives. But, you know, I, for one, found there was a lot of information there for quite a few areas. So I appreciated that.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else wish to speak? No? Are we happy? Do we need to take a vote on this, or is that sure?
The report is just a note, unless you want to make a formal recommendation of those suggestions regarding the inclusion of baseline dates alongside the progressed completion dates and also the inclusion of any benchmarking data.
Okay, I think there was a useful discussion and some agreement around that direction. Councillor Butikofer.
Can I suggest there's maybe a recommendation that we go away and look at the reports and what we can include, and then come back to you with an update at the next meeting or the meeting after?
Councillor Cushing, would you be content with that? So that seems to be a reasonable recommendation. Right. Okay, we will fit that in at an appropriate time in any event. So that recommendation, with that recommendation, we need to take a show of hands vote or a recorded vote?
You can do a show of hands. Just I assume Chris is happy to propose that if we have a seconder for that.
Right, yes. Would you propose that? A seconder, please. Councillor Brown. Right, so with a proposer and seconder, can we have a show of hands then, please, to note this report and to include with that the recommendation outlined by Councillor Butikofer that those matters that were raised will be taken up and reported back to the committee in due course. A show of hands then, please. That looks like unanimous to me. Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Let's return then back to item 10 on our agenda, which is debt recovery for 2020 and 21. Councillor Seaward.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman, I've got my guardians here this morning. Are there?
You're well protected, aren't you?
So I'm well blessed this morning. Clearly, Sean Knight is responsible for preparing this report on debt recovery and is best placed to deal with the technical side of some of this and to answer members' questions. All I will say is that in terms of council tax collection performance last year, it was slightly down, which was not surprising given the circumstances we were facing. In terms of chasing arrears of council tax rates, clearly there was a period last year when this authority, along with other authorities, did not pursue people through the courts to deal with these debts. We are now back in business and there is now some urgency and priority being given to chasing down some of these arrears. So that's the context of which this report is. So, Sean, is there anything else you wish to add at this stage? Right, over to members, Chairman.
Thank you. Questions then on debt recovery? Councillor Withington.
Good morning. I just wanted to talk about our analysis of the types of debt we have, particularly with the business rates debt. I see there's analysis of whether it's insolvency or the reason that it wasn't collected. Do we do with the businesses any analysis of the type of businesses that are in that category? Because I'm wondering whether, if having that information, whether it would then be able to help us direct with our economic growth, and in doing so perhaps bring down those types of debt. We can focus on those sectors if there is a pattern there.
That's a good question. We've never been asked that before. We can do that analysis. We have obviously more details behind the system, but for the purpose of a write-off report, generally we don't go into that kind of detail. But I mean, clearly, Stuart Quick, who's the economic manager, I do work with on lots of different things, so I'm happy to liaise with him. I think obviously through the year of the pandemic and what this report is based on, unfortunately, I don't think it really matters if they're sole trader or limited. I think they've all been struggling in certain fields. So, but yeah, I'm happy to pick that up with Stuart if he wishes to have that kind of data. He might look, he tends to have more of the Norfolk-wide data outside of North Norfolk and obviously further afield. So he might already have some of that information elsewhere, but I don't know.
Thank you.
Okay, that's that. So you'll pick that up as an action, will you? Thank you. Any other questions? No? Right, okay. Well, subject to that action being picked up by Mr. Knight, are you happy to, it says, again, is it to note or approve?
This one is to approve, so if we could have a proposer, a seconder and a vote, please.
Right, okay. Can I have a proposer and a seconder then, please? Got Councillor Heinrich and Councillor Blathwaite. And a show of hands, please, to approve the debt recovery report. Thank you. That looks like unanimous to me. Thank you. Turning to item 11 then, which is the budget monitoring report for 21-22, period 4. Councillor Seward.
Thank you very much, Chairman. This, of course, is the first one for this financial year. It is early days, and it's later reports that will provide a more accurate picture. What I think the overall position is that at the moment we are expecting to deliver a balanced budget again this year. At the moment, there's a slight underspend of just under 90,000. That I think is the important figure. In terms of modelling in the first quarter and why we're actually showing we're not spending as much as we were forecasting. These things are not precise science. I don't think anybody envisaged in the case, for example, of waste collection that for 3 months Serco would not invoice us. That's why we haven't spent any money, but I'm quite happy with that because it stays in our bank account and doesn't go to them. That is unusual, but I'm advised that their invoicing is done in India and perhaps there's a technical problem somewhere, so we haven't got the invoices, but we might have them now. The other thing is in terms of forecasting what income, for example, we will get from parking. I mean, you can play around as much as you like, really. The weather was good May, June time. Our parking income was certainly well above budgeted figures. And once we get the next monitoring report to the end of September, we'll have a clearer picture about how buoyant our parking income is. So those are essentially the reasons at this stage why we're not always in sync with what we were forecasting. But as I said at the beginning, the important figure, I think, is where we're going to be by the end of March. And at the moment, we're aiming towards a balanced budget. But Lucy Hume is here, so if you want to add anything, Lucy, or if members have more detailed questions, I'm sure Lucy can answer them.
Thank you, Councillor Seward. Any questions? Councillor Cushing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question. What would be your greatest concern risks do you think we might have in terms of which may actually have an adverse impact on the budget between now and then?
I think there's probably two things from my perspective, rather than one. I think if you look at the table in section 2.1, which shows the estimated full year effect, you can see the vast majority of that is made up of external interest we'd be earning. There is a risk around that, obviously, for a number of reasons. So that's our current best estimate. Obviously, if the Bank of England bank rate changes any more than it already has done, then that is a risk to that. Also, a large proportion of our interest budget does come from externally managed pooled funds. The interest we've gained from those has been, I think it's fair to say, a little volatile over the COVID-19 pandemic period, due to the fund managers sort of holding back some of those dividends while they're not sure what's going on sort of with the wider economy. So if we do see further lockdowns, touch wood we won't, if we do see further lockdowns, and I would anticipate that figure will fluctuate. So given that makes up the majority of that forecasted full year effect, I would suggest that is a risk. I think secondary to that, around some of our income streams this year so far, luckily we have seen quite a large pickup in terms of against the budget what we had expected, particularly in terms of car parking. I think there's a risk there if we don't get the people into the district on their staycations, and that doesn't prove to be a permanent feature, then that will impact on that income stream, and that will potentially cause us an issue within that area. So I think from my perspective at this point in time, I think it's the income streams that present more of a risk to us than the expenditure.
Okay, thank you.
I think there's one other thing I could add. It is being flagged up at the moment that the number of homeless cases we're having to deal with is rising. The budget, when it was set, because we are buying more temporary accommodation, and the reason we're buying that is because it's a more financially viable way, let alone any that it's a better housing situation, because we're not having to make up the non-recoverable element of the benefits involved when it's in bed and breakfast accommodation. And we were forecasting a saving of some £168,000 this year compared with last year. If those figures continue to rise, even though temporary accommodation is increasing, we're not going to make that saving. So that is another risk that we are faced with at the moment.
Okay, thank you for that. Any other questions? The rest.
Thank you, Chairman. Just to something I heard very early hours of this morning, that the predicted inflation rate is going to be around about 5%. But the Bank of England are not going to increase their base rate. And I think if 5%, 4 to 5%, although Lucy's nodding her head as if she's heard this already, what sort of element are we going to have to really be very careful what we do there? Because that's quite an increase in what's going on at the moment. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's possibly surprising that they're not looking at the moment to do anything with the sort of ratcheting up the bank rate to sort of help bring that inflationary pressure back down. But the last couple of votes in the Monetary Policy Committee have been unanimous to keep the bank rate the same. So they obviously know better than me what they're doing. So given that, but I think the biggest danger for us in terms of CPI inflation getting as far as 5%. I mean, you've got to remember as well that the target the Bank of England has is 2%. So 5% is quite significantly above that. There's certain contractual costs that we have that are linked to different rates of inflation. Some of particularly the waste contract is a good example of that. There are different sort of indices within that. So CPI is one of them, but there's also some more sort of specialist ones. But what we will need to watch is in some of those sort of areas we have that contract spend. If they're linked to CPI inflation at a particular point in the year, if that does start creeping up to 5%, then we might see increased costs at that point. Whether it will get as far as 5% before the MPC do something about it, I couldn't say. But if it does get as far as that, then it will cause us an issue.
Yes, I think we recognise that that is a significant threat, and if the trend continues, then that may become the key concern.
I think the other thing, Chairman, is probably most of us are aware, contractors' costs in the building trade have risen. And certainly when we awarded the contracts for the toilets in Fakenham and Wells, first thing we had to build in was an increase in costs since the original tenders had gone out. So that's another risk that we face.
I think we recognise that there are a number of pressures that are kind of making its way through the system. And what I think we don't know is just how many of those are backing up and how long that sort of catch up will last before inflation perhaps then begins to recede and flatten. But that's anybody's guess. Okay, thank you. Right. Are we all done on that then? So I think we need to note the contents of the report and the current budget monitoring position. Are you content to do that? And would you give us a show of hands to indicate that you are? Thank you. That looks like unanimous to me. Thank you. Item 12 then is the 2020-21 outturn report, period 12 budget monitoring report. Councillor Seward again.
Thank you, Chairman. There's not a lot more I can add in introducing this report to what I said at the Cabinet, but I'm recognised that some members weren't present. We have ended up, after what has been an unusual year, with a surplus of £750,000. I think all I can say is that that does show that our finances are soundly managed. We've not had to take money out of reserves. Indeed, we're doing the other way around. We're actually putting money back into reserves with that surplus. And I am grateful to both the finance team and to Sean Knight's benefits and revenues team for the work that they've done to arrive at this situation. There was an adverse balance in providing services when we take account of adjustments of just over £1 million. But what we were helped by was, first of all, we were entitled to claim a grant under the Fees and Charges Compensation Scheme, which the figures available to me suggest that was somewhere around £640,000. And also in terms of business rate collection and the assistance that the government provided, something like £800,000 were above forecasts in the income we would get from business rates. What I do say is that compared with quite a lot of other councils, though we have received government grants, we are in a strong financial position and we're not still facing difficulties. To those who take great interest in local government finances, you will know there is periodic reports of a range of authorities that are in difficulties. They tend to be of varying political colours, and of course some of them get section 114 notices, which in essence means they're in a bankruptcy situation. We are very far from that. In fact, we're in a strong financial position. In terms of looking forward, I think the uncertainty that I have is what is going to be the level of future central government support that have significant impact on our budgets. I have mentioned and flagged this up in budget reports in recent years, but it is against this kind of background why we are involved in a zero budgeting exercise, which we had the training for or briefing on yesterday. And therefore we've continually got to be ready and alert to deal with all eventualities that we might face financially as an authority. But my determination is to ensure that services that we provide are maintained and that as far as possible, we can avoid having to make significant increases in charges and council tax, though that's capped, in order to get through. But it all depends on the level of financing that we get from central government. Lucy's here this morning. Lucy, do you wish to add anything? And I'm sure that we can take questions from members.
Thank you. Any questions then? Mr. Cushing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Really just to sort of bring up some points again that I think were made in Cabinet. When I asked a question, I think Officer Hume gave us some very interesting figures in terms of the fact that I believe the government actually last year provided £2.4 million in terms of additional support for the council. So if we're looking at, we've got a surplus of just over £750,000. That means in actual fact, that the government gave that extra 1.7 million is the difference. If we haven't had that extra 1.7 million, we'd actually have a deficit of 1.7 million. So I did think Councillor Seawood might be just a little bit more generous and thank poor old Rishi Sunak for his largesse in terms of helping this council during the last year. I think that's something worth noting, I think, in the minutes, please, Mr. Chair.
I mean, look, I am grateful to central government assistance. I think in the position that local authorities were faced with the onset of this pandemic, I don't think any government could have done anything different. Indeed, if they hadn't provided advance payments to provide grants to businesses, local authorities across the board would be in difficulty because they just don't carry that amount of cash. And also, there are no shortage of councils, in spite of all of that government assistance, that are still in deep financial trouble. We are not, and that's the point I was trying to make. But yes, I do acknowledge that we receive government help, but then I think if councils hadn't received government help, there wouldn't be just 3 or 4 with Section 114 notices, there would be dozens.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think there's general recognition on the points that are being made here. It's, I suppose, how you want to tell the story that's often the issue. Any other questions? No?
I think all I can say, Chairman, is that I'm glad I'm not the financial portfolio holder at the County Council.
Thank you. Right, okay, so there are a number of recommendations. We are asked to consider the report and recommend the following to full council. The provisional outturn position for the general fund account for 2021, transfers to and from the reserves detailed within the report, along with the corresponding updates, allocate the surplus of 752,223 to the delivery plan reserve, financing of the 2021 capital programme as detailed within the report and Appendix D, the balance on the general reserve of 2.326 million, the updated capital programme for 21-22 and 24-25, and scheme financing is outlined within the report and detailed at Appendix E. G is the outturn position in respect of the prudential indicators for 2021 as detailed in Appendix F, and H is the roll forward request as outlined in Appendix H. So those are the recommendations. I need a proposer and a seconder, please. For Councillor Blathwaite and Councillor Brown. Can I have a show of hands then to agree those, please? That looks like unanimous to me. Thank you. Right, moving on to item 13 then, Treasury Management Report, Annual Report for 2021. Councillor Seawood.
Chairman, this is the annual report that the council's required to make, along with any other councils. The position is set out in front of you. Again, because of the significant amount of money that was passing through the council books last year, you actually ended up having rather more investments than we would normally have. The long-term investments were about 32 million, the short-term just under 10 million, give us around 42 million pounds. So that's reflected in the report, which is in front of you today. And I did actually see some figures passed to me very recently about the amount of money that's come in from government grants for a whole range of things, much of which we've acted to act as a bouncer. But it is something like, between the start of the pandemic and July of this year, around 130 to 140 million pounds. That's a huge sum of money that we're having to turn around. What I think is encouraging is by the end of July, was only 4 million that we hadn't actually got out. So then I think that again is an enormous tribute to the officers of this council and the work that's being done to ensure that when the money comes in, we don't sit on it, we actually put it to good purpose and and we are actually following what we're required to do. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions? Councillor Penfold.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm just a slightly deeper question, maybe about our investments. Do we have a policy on where or how the money is invested in what companies? And I'm wondering along sort of ethical lines. Thank you.
Yes, that's something that we've actually got in train at the moment. So we're working with our Treasury advisors at Arling Close on a kind of an ESG policy to make sure that our new investments that we make are with counterparties that meet certain criteria around environmental sustainability and governance and things like that. At the moment, we have a lot of our sort of funds with external fund managers, as I mentioned earlier. So that's roughly 32 million, which is the lion's share of our current balance at the moment. We don't have any control then over when they have that money, who they give it to. We do get to find out. They publish a kind of a prospectus each year that tells us where the money is, but we can't tell from that, where our individual pounds are. That's the kind of the pool of everybody's money. But you can certainly select fund managers who have certain ESG related policies that reflect our own. So that's what we're currently doing. So we make sure that the fund managers we work with all have people working on ESG, and that the sort of companies they invest with are sort of acceptable to us. But we are doing more work on that at the moment, and we expect to have an ESG policy of our own to publish in the next few months.
Thank you. Yes, you raise a good point actually, because ESG has given rise to a new term within that sector called greenwashing. And perhaps this is the more cynical side of me, but certainly it's the more cynical side of the insiders of the city who are, as is often the case, the new kid on the block is ESG. And so a lot of people are piling into ESG investments in significant ways, and they're producing quite creditable returns. But I think actually whether it will bear scrutiny as to whether they are truly ESG and to what extent they are being greenwashed will be a matter for the future. So I don't know, by the time we decide what our policy might be in that respect, there may be more information available on whether ESG is truly presenting or truly delivering on what it presents. Any other questions? No? Okay, thank you. Right, so the recommendation here is that we are asked to resolve that the Treasury Management Report and Prudential Indicators are approved. So I need a proposer and a seconder, please. Councillor Heinrich and Councillor Penfold. Thank you. Can I have a show of hands then to approve those? That looks like unanimous to me. Thank you. Moving on then, we've done 14, moving on to 15. Officer delegated decisions, those that were taken between May and August of 21.
I believe we do have Emma available on the Zoom call if, as report author, if there are any questions.
Okay, thank you. Any questions that you'd like to raise in respect of those decisions, delegated decisions? No, we're all content with those. So this is one to receive and note the report and register the register of the officer decision taken under delegated powers. By a show of hands, are you content to do that? Thank you. Right. 15. Item 16 is the Cabinet Work Programme. Right.
Yeah, I don't think there's a huge amount to add here. The one thing I would say, and this was mentioned in the zero-based budget training yesterday, it notes on the October Cabinet Work Programme and on the Scrutiny Work Programme that we might usually would previously expected the medium-term financial strategy at that point in the year. I know that the approach being taken this time around for the year ahead is to take that as the same time as the budget. So we would, I think it was similar to last year, see a draft MTFS at the same time as a draft budget. I think Lucy's nodding there to confirm that. That's an approach that a lot of other councils take. And I think the Director for Resources is looking to move to that approach. Other than that, I think there's not really much to mention there in regard to the Cabinet Work Programme. I don't know if there's anything that should be on there that has been added after the publication of this agenda. Emma, is there anything at all that's been added? Doesn't look to be the case.
Oh, no, as you say, the financial medium-term financial strategy has been bumped back to December now, and the news contract will be coming through to November instead, but nothing additional.
Okay, thank you for that. Any questions in relation to the Cabinet Work Programme? Matt, I don't know whether it's an appropriate time, but I'm aware that we may have the prospect of Cabinet Working Party.
Yes, indeed. So I'm not sure how many of you are aware of this. There, obviously, the terms of reference for the scrutiny panels was agreed some time ago, but it was delayed really to understand what was happening with a Cabinet Working Party, which will essentially form the same function for Cabinet to review ongoing projects and provide governance and oversight of those. So the first meeting of the Cabinet Working Party has been set up for later this month. I believe it's the 27th, possibly. Yeah. In which case, we are, now that that has been arranged, we are looking to have a discussion on the exact working practices of the scrutiny panel. We're thinking due to the workload, there won't be 3 panels as was originally suggested. It might just be 1 for the time being, depending on the amount of work coming forward. I think we need to have just an informal discussion with the Chief Executive, the leader on and the Corporate Business Manager on exactly how we want that to function. And then we can look to get scrutiny members appointed to that scrutiny working panel, and then look to have the first meeting potentially in October.
So just tell me how that will work just for a moment, because as I understand it, there needs to be a meeting between those people that you've just mentioned with regard to the sort of formation of that and the terms of reference of that.
Yeah, so the terms of reference for both have been approved. You remember we took the terms of reference through the Scrutiny Committee some time ago. What needs to be discussed is just exactly how we plan to take reports forward. My understanding is that the Corporate Delivery Unit, the CDU, will prepare reports on all active projects for the Cabinet Working Party to review, and then they would come after that point to the scrutiny panel to review those same reports. I don't know, Steve, you want to add anything to that?
Yes, Chair, I think I would. So we've had an agenda here today with 5 substantive reports on which have previously been to Cabinet. And I think we need to understand what the added value of follow-up scrutiny is in terms of, rather than just sitting through a series of meetings. Obviously, the leader, Councillor Cushing, has raised the same points today, not inappropriately, given the forum that we're in, but does that add any value? And the work and party that Matt has just outlined in terms of project governance needs to be, I think it's been felt, needs to be taken out with normal Cabinet meetings and normal overview and scrutiny meetings. But the biggest projects which this authority is taking forward at the present time are the new leisure centre in Sheringham and the Heritage Action Zone project in North Horsham. And you received detailed reports on those at your substantive meeting in July. So at the moment, I need to work with yourself, the leader, and the corporate delivery unit to understand democratic services, to differentiate what added value there is out with, because I'm not sure at the moment that we're working efficiently or smartly. And there are issues of emerging policy around housing strategy, the customer service strategy, which you saw in pre-scrutiny. And so I have taken reference from the LGA to look at how our overview and scrutiny in terms of reference sits with other authorities, because there needs to be added value to any discussion that takes place, making best use of officer time and elected member time. So I'm not saying that the principle of the scrutiny and what is proposed is wrong, but we need to make sure that that work is aligned and there is appropriate mechanisms built in for that scrutiny challenge, that corporate learning and reflection, to warrant separate meetings of panels, because otherwise we're just bouncing things back between a panel and a substantive committee, be that Cabinet or ONS.
I think that the principle you outline is recognised. I think that what would be helpful, and I'm not sure whether today is the right day, but I think what would be helpful to members is to understand how that will work in practice.
Absolutely. I mean, the issue around the original 3 panels that were proposed for ONS was to allow panels or working parties of ONS to get into the detail of issues around, currently issue. I understand there's a proposal to look at second homes policy again, which is obviously something that impacts very significantly on this district. There will be, you've said this morning that you want to understand more around the medium-term financial strategy, and if we go for a revision of charging policy around car parking or beach huts and chalets or other forms of income generation, that, in my opinion, would be formative within ONS and recommendations going up to Cabinet, rather than that being done retrospectively. But if we move away from those 3 panels, which was around intended to give degree of focus, that does need to be resourced, but it's about adding value, I think, and we need to work smarter.
I think your point is very well made. In fact, I think historically this committee has had panels formed, although during this particular administration we haven't moved to that model, and I think there are 1 or 2 reasons for that. And I think the last time we had a discussion on that, there was a degree of, I think, nervousness about moving to that model, and the decision was taken, I think, not to do that right at that time, but to review that. And maybe this is the time to review that model, and maybe this is the time to look more closely at the opportunity that you described. But I think I'm just trying to get in my head, if there is to be a first meeting of a panel of this committee in October, is that your?
That's only
expectation?
subject. I think we need to have those initial discussions first with the chief executive and others as to how it's going to function before we do that. That is only a very provisional.
So the presentations that were made to this committee on the Reef Leisure Centre and the Heritage Action Zone in North Horsham in July was much more detailed than has been discussed as a collective at Cabinet. So the lead members for those projects, Councillor Gay and Councillor Richard Kershaw, they've shared the principal high-level issues around those projects, but that detailed scrutiny, challenging, questioning, consultation and engagement would take place at the Cabinet Working Party. But the challenge that I've given is, well, scrutiny already had that, because that responsibility sits with that lead portfolio holder. You know, I have every confidence, and Councillor Gay has attended your meetings regularly and provided updates with Rob Young and Kate Rawlings as to the progress of the reef. And similarly, there is a very extensive but appropriate, in my view, given the corporate learning around project delivery previously, around how the Heritage Action Zone is being progressed. So there has been public consultation, there is a project board, local members and Councillor Richard Kershaw as portfolio holder are on that. And that mechanism and structure was shared with you at your meeting in July, but it has that structure hasn't been, that progress hasn't been shared formally at Cabinet on their agendas. And so it's about striking that balance between that scrutiny, that transparency and the confidence that you have as an ONS relative to the leadership role and ownership that Cabinet members need to have for the delivery of those main projects, which was where we got to in terms of the corporate governance framework. And it's about making that in terms of accessible, in terms of the opportunity to challenge and whether we add value to that process or whether we are just reproducing reports in a different or presenting them in a different arena.
That I think is probably understood and accepted. The greatest concern I have is understanding how we get from where we are right now.
Answer to that yet.
Right, okay, so there is no point, I don't think, in discussing this much more other than to say that that's work in progress.
Yeah, and we will certainly look to have those discussions as soon as possible to get that in place.
Yeah, so at the earliest, as I see it, if there is to be a panel of this committee, then the decision on that as to who is appointed to that panel would be perhaps on our October agenda.
Yes, I think as part of the terms of reference, there was kind of delegation giving to group leaders to appoint to the panels.
Yes, but I would have thought that this committee would want to have a view on who was going to be on a panel of this committee, because in effect, that panel would be operating on behalf of this full committee.
Yeah, I think certainly.
That's the concern, in that if there is a panel and that reports back to this committee then needs to be having confidence in the delegation that's given to that panel, because otherwise the conversation will just be had 2 weeks later at this committee with the 15 members or however many are on. And I think that's where at the moment, I don't think there is clarity around the delegation that's given to the panel, the powers they would have relative to that reporting back through this committee.
Right, okay, I think I'll probably leave it at that point. Councillor Penfold, you had your hand raised.
Thank you. And I know we don't want to get into a debate about it really now, but I do support what Steve is saying there. I think, you know, we are deep diving in this committee, and to take, for example, the Heritage Action Zone, that's now a quarterly report back to us on our overview and scrutiny work programme, and Cabinet members responsible for that and Councillor Gay for the reef have been more than accommodating in you know what we've asked of them. So my concern would be about doubling up on something where it doesn't need to be. And if you put a panel in place and then, you know, reporting back to this committee could just be the same information, or things could get missed. So I think that.
Yes, there are pluses and minuses here. The pluses undoubtedly is that a panel can work more time efficiently and delve in deeper ways and make perhaps better use of officer time in that respect. The danger is that if that panel, when it reports back to this committee, as it inevitably will need to do, that we don't rehearse the same debate and have the same discussions. So there'll need to be an understanding and acceptance that that panel has carried out a piece of work on behalf of the committee. And I think it would be right for that panel to report back to this committee, and therefore other members of this committee may well have questions with regard to the decisions reached by that panel, or the recommendations being made by that panel. But I don't think it would be helpful to have a second round of debate, and otherwise we are just adding another layer of duplication.
And I think that's the issue, Chair. I think it's an issue of confidence in process, confidence in any panel that's established and their ability to report back, and then what legitimate challenge or added value the wider committee is able to give, because it shouldn't be rehearsing all of that conversation that's previously been had. It should be adding those nuggets, if you like, that really add value and take us up to the next level. And I don't know whether what is proposed actually will achieve that at the present time. Okay. And that's been given sharp focus to me, I think, given the depth of the presentations that you received on the reef and the HAS in July, and the fact, as Councillor Penfold has said, there is now a wish, certainly for the HAS. Obviously, we're moving towards completion of the reef, but certainly for the HAS, there is a wish that this committee, not a panel of this committee, not according to the recommendation that you've approved, will receive a quarterly report. And I think it's that we need to work smarter on.
Okay, fine. Councillor Penfold.
Yeah, just to say, I wouldn't want this committee to not have access to the portfolio holder, for example. So for the portfolio holder to become the preserve of the panel only, and then the panel to report back what the portfolio holder has said to them, rather than this panel being able to question the portfolio holder directly. Sorry, this committee being able to do that.
Yes, picking up on that point, I mean, I would expect this panel would want to reserve to itself decisions on which matters went to a panel and which came to the full committee. And that might be something to be worked out in the future. I think that it would be wise to for this committee to have that ability to decide on what topics it wanted to see and which it was content and comfortable with in being delegated to a panel. I think that that's a discussion that needs to be a part of that bigger discussion that you have.
But I think that's right, but you also won't know what you don't know. So at the moment, so nationally, the government has now announced, and Councillor Seward has been advised of this, and is working with Duncan Ellis on a submission to the government for a call of 8 or 10 weeks on changing places provision nationally. So this is something that this authority has had an ambition, and a stated ambition, has already allocated funds for, and a stated ambition that it would like to see the provision of a changing place in each of our principal settlements, you know, as and when funds allow. The government has now launched a programme which, as I say, Duncan is working with the portfolio holder on, because at this moment in time it is an expression of interest. That is something that, in my view, over in Scrutiny could absolutely own and champion as an emerging issue from the authority. And yet, if the funding is approved, it's something that is tangible and can be, as I say, owned here, because that's something Cabinet would then direct in terms of where spend might be. But in terms of what we did, how we did it, the type, whether it was a partnership, whether it was exclusively provided by this authority, how that sits with public car parks or electric vehicle charging points, that's a strategy issue that probably should come in a formative sense from this group.
Thank you. Councillor Williams.
Thank you. I think this, what I'm about to say, probably highlights exactly that point, actually, Steve, that we've got, and although I'm moving on to the ONS work programme, we've got the beach huts and chalet monitoring coming up. Now, that could be presented, and I'm sure the officers will do a great job in presenting that to us, but I know there are focuses that we will want to hear about. And I think our role is, if that comes to us in October, we've had no input at this stage in terms of what we want that monitoring to be about and to include. And I think we need to have a much greater role in that, in deciding what we want to be coming forward to us, so that we can actually evaluate it and scrutinise it properly. So, I mean, that came up in our training, if you remember, when we did that training, that part of the role was for us to be setting what was coming to us and making sure we had got that information. So I don't know how that fits in with what's being talked about at the moment, but I mean, I certainly, rather than see that report come to us in October, I'd rather us be setting exactly what we want to see and it becoming a little later.
Could I just come back on that one? That is, so the beach huts and chalets was something that in the previous administration was a task and finish group. And I think we spent probably just under a year with a scrutiny task and finish group looking at that in great detail. So I think on that particular subject, there has to be some level of trust in what was done by a previous scrutiny committee rather than repeating a process which has already been done. I wouldn't want to go back through that very detailed, painstaking process. That is purely an update on that work that was already done, taking into consideration that the management of that service has now changed hands, but they're still working with the task and finish group review that did take place. So that's building upon that essentially.
Okay. I think the point you're making is a valid one in principle. I think in that particular example, it's obviously there's history there that needs to be carried forward, and so. But I think we've had an interesting exploratory discussion on this, and for me, I'm open-minded, but I want to hear more about what this is going to look like, and before we make any decisions. And I think the earliest time that we'll be able to make a decision will be our October meeting. So is that an expectation, a reasonable expectation that on that occasion, we'll have a model which will be fully discussed and be able to be presented to us as a way forward? Okay. Are we content to leave that matter at that point? Anybody else wish to? No? Right, okay, thank you. So moving on then to the overview and scrutiny work programme.
Yeah, so looking at October, as I previously mentioned, the MTFS is on there. That won't be coming forward in October. There are discussions that have taken place as we just discussed. There has been discussions on that beach huts and chalets monitoring coming forward. That was delayed once already to allow for the full kind of summer occupancy levels to be included in that monitoring report. So that will be coming forward. There has also been some early discussions with Steve Hems on the waste contract monitoring. Obviously, there have been some difficulties recently with Serco, and I think he thought that October would be an appropriate time to bring that forward. So he is in discussion with representatives from Serco to see if they're happy to come to the October meeting and report on that. Similarly, on the planning performance review there, I did have some initial discussions with, appreciate that the director for place wasn't involved in those, but with Philip Rowson as the assistant director there. He has recently implemented a kind of planning performance monitoring to go to development committee. And we're hoping that we can expand on that to bring it to overview and scrutiny. And then finally, as was discussed there, the HAS project monitoring can come forward, I expect, to the October meeting. Again, there does need to be discussion on how that continues, obviously, whether that's appropriate for the committee or the panel. But we will leave that to discussion as previously suggested.
Okay, thank you for that. Any questions? Councillor Brown.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members here present might remember probably back in June or July, I raised a query about the implementation and performance of the uniform installation computer project. I don't actually see that on the Cabinet Work Programme in front of me, I see an item on page 203 which refers to website design and functionality. It's a scoping report required, request from the committee, but I just want clarification whether that would include some information about the performance of the new uniform software system.
Yeah, I think that is a separate item. I think if I remember correctly, you raised that during a previous performance monitoring report, that you requested in there a section on the uniform system. I think we can certainly chase that up, and I think also there's scope for a discussion to be had there with the Assistant Director for planning to perhaps include that in the planning performance review to see what impact that has had on the service, perhaps.
I'm quite happy for it to proceed in that manner. I just didn't want it to be missed, as it were, because we're coming up to, I think, the first anniversary of its installation in December. So it would seem appropriate either at the next meeting or the November meeting to
I think, yeah, that's a very good point.
to have an update on how the project is going.
Yeah, I think it would be particularly valid to include that in the planning performance review and see what changes that has had to the service itself.
Might that lead, in fact, if we do it that way, might that lead then, or if I'm just hypothecating now, that if there are issues of uniform that has affected the planning performance significantly, we of course may want to say, well, can we have a further review of what's going on there, and that might take you to closer perhaps to what you might have had in mind originally. I don't know.
I think it probably would do, Mr. Chairman. I think it's something that we as a committee should be monitoring quite closely moving forward, I think. And if that achieves it, then I'm perfectly happy with that.
And I think that is precisely the point. The 5 things on this page 203, plus the uniform challenge, those things should legitimately be discussed here, with recommendations being made up to cabinets and the portfolio holder, the relevant portfolio holder, owning that challenge from overview and scrutiny to make things better. Shouldn't have that conversation here and a separate conversation in isolation in cabinet. The 2 things should come together, and there should be a collective and agreed position moving forward. And I think at the moment, much of your agenda, you talk about one thing in cabinet, and then a separate group of people talk about things here, and then they're reported as anomalies or points of difference at full council. And I don't think it needs to be that contentious. I think there can be greater collaboration by discussing those points of difference initially here, and recommendations being made publicly up to cabinet for cabinet to own and respond to. And at the moment, I don't think we've got that flow of challenge, decision making, scrutiny rights. And that's why I think we need to look at the process, because all of these things here on page 5 plus uniform could be the work of a panel that kicks those issues around in an overview and scrutiny committee, then presents their recommendations, findings, conclusions, shortcomings, best practice, learning or whatever, something you're really proud of, can be sent up to this wider panel overview and scrutiny, with then a recommendation to cabinet. That for me is continuous learning and improvement. And I don't think that's where we are at the present time.
Great, thank you very much indeed. So with those comments on the work programme, are you happy to note both the cabinet work programme and the overview and scrutiny work programme? Show of hands, please. Thank you. Right. There are no other matters on our agenda, so that concludes our business today. Councillor Rest.
Mr. Chairman, with your indulgence, can I just simply ask one question? I've noticed today 3 times the title of corporate business manager has been mentioned. I wonder if we could have an update on what this is and who this person is. I have checked, a couple of other colleagues don't seem to be aware of this either. Thank you.
Yeah, that's fine. So that's it's not a new post. It's a realignment of roles. It was advertised internally. It is bringing together the corporate PA team that supports the civic function, the externally focus of CLT in terms of strategic engagement with partners out with the authority and the line management of the corporate delivery unit around project governance. It is to ensure there's a focus on improved performance management. If you recall, when I put forward the management restructure, there was a number of people that said I had too many direct line management responsibilities for individuals within that corporate delivery unit, which hadn't come together. And so this development does achieve that, and Linda McGilligan is that person.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much indeed. Well, that concludes our business today. Thank you very much indeed, everyone, for attending and for your respective inputs. I close the meeting.